Okay, so now we're going to start with Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is all about trimming. Again, we continue on with the project that we created in Chapter 4 by importing the DRP. So that will have all of our projects up here in the rough cuts bin, and we're going to go to O2 Trim Rough Cut. We're just going to double click it and load it into the viewer here. And if you want, you can come up and choose to reset the UI. You can also Shift Z to get the entire timeline in here. The timeline is pretty much the same as you left it, maybe a couple of tweaks, just so we can trim some stuff, but it's essentially the same timeline. And to begin with, we talk about customizing the user interface. For instance, now that we're in trimming, we don't really need to have all of this area taken up by the bin and the media pool, so you can come up and you can click on the media pool button just to hide all that and give us much more room for our timeline and for our viewers. You also can do things like come over to the timeline view options here and click on it, and if we want to increase the size of the thumbnails and decrease the size of the audio, we can do that. We can also come and choose to see just a single viewer, and the single viewer allows us to increase the size of it. And to increase the size of it, what we would do is come to just above the toolbar and the transport controls, just in between the two, you'll get a resize cursor, and you can just drag it down, expanding the viewer, and now we have a much larger viewer. And with all of these changes, you can come up to the workspace and you can save this as a layout preset. So we'll come into layout, and you can see I've already saved it, but we could just say save layout as preset. I'm going to call mine big trim mode because that's mostly what we're doing, and you can see it here. So you can save your layouts in the user interface, and we can come back to it whenever we need to. So now that we have this large trim mode, we're going to start to trim, and we're going to start trimming by going to the beginning of the timeline, and we deal with the first clip here, and we'll play over it so people can see the difference.
Yeah. So in this film, making a documentary about how the airplanes changed the world, it was really important to go out and shoot the real world and how the airplane is connecting and making all the things possible.
All right, so clearly it is too long of a clip, both at the head of it and at the tail of it. We want to chop some things off. One of the quickest ways is to use what's often called tops and tail trimming. And this is a kind of something used in broadcast a lot, where you cut in, each cut you cut in has more than what you would really want. You make the clips longer and you cut kind of loose, and then you come back and you trim it. So what we're going to do is trim it using that style just by coming in and putting the playhead where we want to start it. So I'm going to play this.
Yeah. So in this,
and it's going to be right around here, and you can see again the gap in the timeline, the waveform. If you want to zoom in, we can see this nice little space here. So, and then here's the start of his sentence. So maybe just in between there, this is where we want to trim it. And if we just want to come up and say trim start, which is also shift open bracket, you'll see what it does. It cuts off the beginning and cuts it to the playhead, and that's pretty good because it will start right where we want it to start. Unfortunately, it leaves this big gap in the timeline. It doesn't ripple everything up. So we're going to undo that, and we're going to do it the way it will ripple it, so in bringing everything up, and it will still start at the head of the timeline. And the way you do that is by switching into the trim tool. So you can trim with the selection tool and it will open up a gap like it did. If you trim with the trim tool, it's going to do the same edit, but it's going to ripple everything up to the beginning of the timeline. So let's go back up to our trim menu now that we have the trim edit tool selected, and just choose the same thing, trim start. Now watch what happens. It trims all of the clip, but it starts at the beginning of the timeline. So it ripple trims the timeline.
In this film, making a documentary about how the airplanes changed the world, it was really important to go out and shoot the real world and how the airplane is.
So we're actually going to trim it right where he says shoot the real world, and we're going to end it there. So if we backed up, and we could either JKL over it.
Shoot the real world.
And you can see again in your wave form right here in the timeline, you can see there's a gap there in the sentence. So we're going to trim it right to that point after he says shoot the real world.
The real world.
And I might nudge this over using my arrow keys just so I'm in the middle there. Now again, I'm on the trim edit mode tool. So that means it's going to ripple trim. So when it removes all these frames to the playhead, it's going to ripple trim all the rest of the clips up. So we'll go up to the timeline, and then instead of trim the start, we want to trim the end, which is shift close bracket. Now when we do this, everything ripples to the timeline. Now look what happened to our music track, right? We don't want that to happen to our music track, so we're going to undo this. We're going to turn off that auto select. And we're going to go up to our trim mode and do the same exact thing, trim, and now it ripple trims the timeline. And here we might come back and shift Z, or under the view menu, zoom to fit, just to see the entire timeline. The next thing we're going to do happens right around the 10 Maldives clip. So if you want to do that, we can just play through this.
If it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to go shoot it. If we couldn't get the shot or the weather wasn't...
Okay, so maybe one thing you may have noticed is at the start of this 10 Maldives clip, the plane starts already on the frame, and we'd like to have it so it begins just with the sky, and then the plane flies in instead of having it halfway on the screen. To do that, we need to add some frames to the head or the start of this clip, right? So we're going to do that in trim mode because we want to ripple trim. Now if we were in the selection tool, it would overwrite, right? We'd add frames and it would overwrite the tail of this clip, which we don't want to do. We want to select the trim tool and we just want to ripple it. So it's not going to affect the A380 takeoff clip. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. When you're in the trim edit mode tool, you can come over to the left hand side of the cut. You can see when you're on the left hand side of the cut, you'll trim the tail of that A380 takeoff. That's what that icon looks. When you move over to the right side of the cut, you can see you get a different icon pointing to the head of this clip, which means you're going to trim the head of the Maldives clip, the start of the Maldives clip. So that's where we want to be. So we want to trim with the cursor on the right hand side. We want to select it, and you can see when you select it, it turns green. That starting point turns green, which means we can start to trim, and that's the side of the cut we would trim. So to trim, all we have to do is click, and we want to add frames. So we're going to drag to the left, and you can see up in the above, you now have, if we drag to the right, you can see the plane. What you're looking at is the last frame of that A380 takeoff clip on the left, and the first frame that you're going to see from this Maldives clip on the right. So where do we want that to be? I'm going to back it up just so that it's out of frame, maybe just trim 5 frames. And then we can let go. And to review that, all you have to do is you can go up to the playback menu, and you can choose play around current selection. Also, this / key will do this.
If it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to go shoot it.
Now that's great, but maybe you want it to come in even a little bit later, so you want to add a few more frames. If you know you just want like a beat, like a 1 second more at the start of this clip, you can use the keyboard shortcuts again. You can use the keypad. So if I want to add more frames to the head of this clip, I want to get more frames on the left side. So remember, moving things to the left is a negative value, but moving things to the right is a positive value. So what we're going to do is we're going to -1 period, enter. And now we can play this back just pressing the / key.
If it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to go shoot it.
And we have a beat. Now if that's too long of a beat, maybe you just want to trim a few frames off, you can use the period and the comma key as well to nudge them 1 frame at a time. So comma will add a frame to the head, and a period will take away frames to the head. So we can just go period, 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 and you can see I'm just taking away 3 frames, and then we can try that again with the forward slash to
Possible
play
to
it.
shoot it, we wanted to go shoot it.
And that's it. It goes back to the beginning. So in this, what we teach is the placement of the cursor changes between trimming the tail of the clip or trimming the head of a clip. You want to teach them how to use the keypad and the direction that they're trimming, and you want to teach them the period and the comma key. Those are the key things. All of this being in the trim edit mode for ripple trimming, right? We did nothing to change the A380 takeoff clip. The other thing that you want to explain here is about handles, right? You want to explain to people that you can only trim so far as you have handles, and handles is the amount of media that you've captured. So if this clip, the Maldives clip, didn't have an additional 1 second at the beginning to trim out, you don't have enough handle to trim. That's the terminology people will use, and so you want to teach people the terminology of the handles. Okay, so let's go, and we're going to Shift Z. Just Shift Z to see the entire timeline, because now we're going to move over to this Milky Way clip at the start of this Milky Way clip. And this is going to teach us how to select tracks. So you kind of play through this Milky Way clip and through the next interview.
It's really important. Every shot was original and that everything was real.
So a lot of times what you will do is you, especially when you're dealing with dialogue, but even in this case where you just have someone on camera, to lead the person into the next cut, instead of having a hard cut where picture and sound both come in together, you might create an L or a J cut where either picture or sound comes in earlier. For instance, we might want to hear his voice when we're still seeing the Milky Way, and then cut to it after maybe the first sentence. So we can see here,
It's really important.
maybe when he says it was really important, that's where you want to see the picture. So we're going to zoom in again using our slider. And you can see it's really important, and this is kind of the gap there. So if we start to trim, maybe we want to take away frames from the beginning. We want to drag this to the right to take away frames from the beginning of this, just so we overlap this right here, the Milky Way. So if we come in and we're still on our trim edit mode tool, so we'll be ripple trimming, we're going to hover so our pointer is on the right side of the clip. We're going to select it. If we trimmed by default right now, it's going to trim both picture and sound, and we don't want that. We just want to trim, delay his picture coming in, but we want to leave the sound where it is. So we need to do what we did before to break the sync relationship, the link between the picture and the sound. I'm going to click off into the gray area. I'm going to come over to my toolbar and click the link button. And now when I select the picture, you can see that only the video track is selected. And if I start dragging to the right, now you see that it overlaps the picture with the sound.
It's really important. Every shot
And
was
it cuts
original.
back as soon as he says important. Now it's important to see that why did this happen? We're trimming one side of a cut. Usually that will throw things out of a sync when you're ripple trimming one side of a cut. But our auto selects on the video and audio track help us keep these in sync. I'm going to undo this, and I'm going to now turn off the auto select on audio 1. Now watch what happens when I trim this. It throws everything out of sync, right? And that's not what we want. So our auto select buttons that are on A1 and V1 are helping keep us in sync as we trim one side of a cut. So they're really helpful to know about.
It's really important. Every shot was original and that everything was real.
So that's again ripple trimming. Now you can also do what's called a roll trim. A roll trim, remember we talked about having the cursor on the left side of the cut means we're going to trim the tail, or on the right side of the cut it's going to trim the head of this incoming shot. But when it's directly over the cut point, you're going to trim both the head and the tail of the cut. So here we've selected it. And you can do this either in trim mode or in selection mode. It works the same exact way in either mode. You just hover your mouse point over the cut. You'll get the double handle that tells you you're not trimming one side or the other, you're trimming both. And now we can trim this. I'm going to drag this in a little bit so it overlaps on the outgoing way as well. So the first one is called a J cut because it looks like a J, and the second one is called an L cut where the picture cuts out sooner and the audio goes longer. So we can play that.
And that everything was real.
and you have a nice little roll cut. Now that trims equally the tail and the head of that cut point. So you're not throwing anything out of sync, and you're not changing the duration of your timeline, because on a roll trim, you're adding and subtracting an equal amount of frames from both sides of that cut point. Okay, we're going to do Shift Z again. We're going to switch back to our normal edit mode tool, and I'm going to come down and teach a different trim tool, and we're going to play this clip, this A380 takeoff.
If it was possible to shoot it, we wanted to go shoot.
Now you can see about this clip, I like where it is, I like the duration of it, but it doesn't particularly end well, right? It just ends before it takes off, and you really want to see at least the wheels lift off to kind of get a completion of that shot. We don't really care where it begins, but we'd like it to end later. So what I'm going to do is switch to my trim edit mode tool. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this clip a little bit longer. Now we talked about, depending on where you place your cursor, at the end of a cut, at the start of the cut, or directly over a cut, it's contextual, meaning it changes the function of the trim while you're doing that. It also happens that if you move your cursor over the center of the thumbnail or anywhere over the thumbnail, you're going to get a slip cursor. And what that slip cursor now does is, if you click and start dragging, meaning I want to make this later, so I'm going to drag it to the left, you can see up the top what you're getting is a 4-up display, and that 4-up display shows you the first frame, your in point on the upper left, and your out point on the upper right of that clip. And as I drag, you can see how they're changing. You're moving the content, you're slipping the content of that clip. You're not changing its duration or where it is in the timeline, you're just changing the in and out point of that clip. So I'm going to drag to the left until the wheels are totally out of frame, maybe even the tail's out of frame, so it looks like it just took off. Now down the bottom, what you're seeing is the last frame of the clip before our A380 takeoff and the first frame that comes in after our A380 takeoff. Now that's not going to change because we're not changing the position of this clip in the timeline. We're just changing the content that is within that clip. So once I have where it is, I just let go of my mouse and I can play this. It starts a little closer to us now. Lufthansa takes off.
If it was possible to shoot it,
and it's out of frame when it ends. It's a much better shot that way. Alright, I'm going to do Shift Z, see my entire timeline again. You can just keep doing this so people understand what Shift Z, what it does, and they get used to that keyboard shortcut. So we don't cover too many keyboard shortcuts, but that's certainly one of them that we do over and over. Okay, so now what we end up doing is switching over to our selection tool and explaining that you can trim with the selection tool as well. And we go back to this Milky Way clip. It's a very long clip, so if we start in our South Pole and play it over the Milky Way, you can see it's a very long clip, and we want to make this a little shorter. Now you can trim with your trim mode tool, but you can also trim with your selection mode tool. And what the difference is explained right now. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see the beginning of this Milky Way. I'm going to hover my mouse over it, and even though I'm not in the trim edit mode tool, you still get a trim cursor. And I'm going to select it and start dragging to the right. And instead of ripple trimming the timeline, what it does is it opens a gap. I'm going to trim about 4 seconds off to open up a 4-second gap. And you might explain to people why they might want to open up a gap. Maybe you want to leave a space for a clip that's coming in later, or you're not quite sure what to put in there. You're just going to leave it blank to remind you that you want to fill it in later. So the ripple trim is with the trim tool, and the selection tool opens up gaps or overwrites clips. And that's the main difference that you want people to carry away with. So now that we have this gap, we might want to fill it. And in that case, we do want to see our media pool. So I'm going to go up to my upper left corner and click on the media pool button. I'm going to come down to my B-roll clip. And I can still view any of the source clips, even though I have one viewer. So I can just double click on Kenya, which is one of the clips we haven't used yet. And I can say, oh, I want to use this clip now. And so once I double click on it, now I'm viewing the source viewer, and you can see the name says 07 Kenya up the top. So maybe I want to pick an in point right when this plane is kind of pointing up directly. And that's going to be my endpoint, so I'm just going to hit I. Now in the timeline, and as soon as I touch this playhead in the timeline, the viewer is going to switch to show me the timeline. I want to fill this gap. So I don't really care about an out point for my Kenya clip because I know how long it has to be. It has to be the length of this gap. And what I want to do is I want an easy way to say mark an endpoint from the beginning of this gap to the end of this gap. And where that is under your mark menu. You have something called mark clip. The keyboard shortcut is X. So when I choose mark clip, look what it does. It automatically goes and finds the duration of this clip. In this case, it's a gap, and it marks an in point and an out point around it. So all I have to do right now is I can just hit the overwrite button, and it uses the Kenya clip to fill in the gap right where we marked our in point. Now, two things about this. One is that Milky Way still feels a little bit long to me, and the other thing is this clip just ends right when it starts to get good with this plane coming on screen. So what I want to do is I need to look at my source viewer and my timeline viewer at the same time. So I'm going to go back up to my upper right corner, and I'm going to switch it to a dual viewer, right? From single viewer to dual viewer. And one thing that I can do is double click on this clip in the timeline to load that into my source viewer. Now, the important part you need to know about this, and you really want to stress this because a lot of people make this mistake, is they think when they double click that clip, it loads it from the bin into the source viewer, but it doesn't. What it actually does is take a live version of this 07 Kenya clip from the timeline and loads it into the source viewer. And you can tell that because up above it, it says 07 Kenya, the name of the clip, and 02 Trim Rough Cut, the name of the timeline. So it's taking the clip from the timeline and loading it in. And the difference is that if you make any modifications to your in point and out point on this source clip, it's going to modify it in the timeline. It is not taking the clip from the bin, and that's what you really need to stress to people. So what you can do is you can come over here and say, what is further down on this clip? Oh, look, flamingos come in. That would be nice to include. Maybe I want to include it right when the first flamingo is down towards the bottom here. Now you could just come over and drag this out point because it's a little bit more visual to see what's happening. As I drag this out point, look what happens in the timeline. The more I drag it, it overwrites that Milky Way clip, right? If I made it shorter, it would open up a gap. If I make it longer, it's going to overwrite that Milky Way clip. So unlike double clicking a clip in the bin and loading into the source viewer, when you double click it from the timeline, you're able to modify the in and out points and have it live update in the timeline. So it's very important, different to know that you're doing that because it's a very easy thing to do, double clicking it, and you might think it's just from the bin. So you want to stress that. Okay, so now that we trimmed in the source viewer, the last thing I want to show you is a slide clip. So we trimmed this in. And it definitely cuts off a little bit of the South Pole a little early. So what I might want to do is just push this down a little bit further, push this Kenya down. It will take away a little bit from the Milky Way, but it will give me a little bit more from the South Pole. Now you could absolutely do dual rolls, right? I could roll trim here and I could roll trim here and push them both to the right an equal amount. Or I can go to my trim edit mode tool, and just like we hovered over the thumbnail to get a slip function, if we hover over the name bar down at the bottom, we can get a slide function. And the slide function is going to do exactly what we just said. It's going to roll both sides of the clip equally. So you can see up in the top, what you're seeing is the first frame and the last frame of the clip, right, in the quad split up in the top. And that's not going to change because we're not changing the content of this clip. This time we're just sliding it along the timeline, changing its position. And that's why the bottom two clips change as you drag, because you're changing where they start and end. And I'm just going to drag this, my little tooltip, maybe about 10 frames, and that's it. And now we've extended this South Pole by 10 frames. Same exact Kenya clip, and we've taken away 10 more frames from the start of the Milky Way.
It was really important. Every shot was original and that everything was real.
And there we have our timeline. And I'm going to shift Z again. The last bit is kind of tricky. It is about subframe audio trimming. So I'm going to take this very first little standalone segment here.
If it was possible to shoot.
You can see
It was possible.
kind of, if you listen to it closely, it kind of is like it clipped up a little bit of the if.
It was possible to.
Right? So we might want to extend this by 1 frame. So this is a hard thing to show, subframe audio edits, just so you know. It's a hard thing to show because you really need to have a very specific case. So this is a very contrived case, if you will. First you have to show them why you need to do it. So I'm going to move to my selection tool. And I'm going to add a frame to the head of this clip just by pressing the comma key. Now when I do that, you listen to it again, and there's a little bit of the So we're caught in between adding a little bit of the or, if we subtract that frame again, clipping out a little bit of the if.
It was possible.
Right? So what you can do instead is you can subframe trim it. And what you do first is you take off the magnet tool, which is snapping. So here's our, remember we've been snapping all along with the playhead. Well, this is that button that does it. It's a little magnet icon. And now with our selection tool in place and our snapping turned off, we can come down to this audio clip, and I'm going to zoom in all the way. And if we just want to trim it subframe, we just start trimming it. And you can see as I'm dragging, my tooltip isn't changing to a frame, but eventually will if I go far enough. Now it's at 1 frame, but now that I'm underneath it, I can just add a little bit somewhere in between the 1 frame mark. And there I'm audio subframe editing, and I can play it.
If it was possible.
And it doesn't sound, I don't get any of the but it definitely has that beginning if in there. So there is subframe audio editing. I'm going to turn on my snapping and my linking again. And that is the trim section. It's a fairly short and sweet section. And now we move on to lesson 6.